Welcome to the Myofascial Health Podcast, hosted by me, Unu. Follow along as I explore the depths of John Barnes' myofascial release approach on my road to mastery. Along the way, I'll be sharing the lessons I learn as I open my myofascial release practice in Austin, Texas, so that you don't have to make the same mistakes I do. Welcome back to the Myofascial Health Podcast. Now, I'm joined here by a very special guest. Normally, I'll interview myofascial release therapists, but today I have the honor of interviewing one of my patients, and his name is Travis Christ. He's been in Austin for about 12 years. He went to school in North Texas, the Denton area, if you're familiar. He waited tables through college, got into a glass blowing apprenticeship, found his way into customer service with Apple, and essentially became a software developer. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Yeah, really happy to be here. A little confused why I'm here, but I'm excited to kind of find out what's going on.
So the reason why I wanted to interview you is, one, to hear your perspective. I think as the therapist, I have my perspective on, how treatment goes, how healing for the human body goes. But I think it's very different to be on the patient side of that. And so I had found you through a workshop at the climbing gym, actually. I had done a Healthy Fingers workshop, and I work with rock climbers as part of my niche, and you were there and you went through the workshop, and then you decided, hey, let's move forward with physical therapy. And I have had a wonderful time being able to treat you, and part of that is because one of my favorite jobs is the ability to learn from my patients. Everyone comes from a different walk of life, and I know that our conversations through physical therapy and myofascial relief has shed a lot of insights, just on your perspective, how you process things. Let me just ask you, what was the experience in your own words of working with someone like me? And I don't know if you have a point of comparison from working with someone in just the regular healthcare industry.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, like this has been the best healthcare experience that I've ever had. I was really athletic as a kid. I played a lot of different sports, primarily baseball, and I had a lot of injuries related to that over the years. And so I'm very familiar with the like, hey, let's go to the doctor, get this checked out. Hey, let's do some physical therapy for a while kind of circle of life that seems to happen for me a lot. So those were great experiences, but I never really felt like the problem was resolved. It would just kind of come back time and time again. So I've been pretty skeptical of the whole healthcare field for most of my life. And then when I found you, it was at the Healthy Fingers workshop, and it was actually that was really serendipitous. It was about a week after I had torn my A2 finger pulley in my middle finger. And so I was pretty desperate at the time. Climbing had really come to mean a lot to me in my life, and I was really desperate to find a solution so that I could kind of keep going with it as a sport and as a kind of a way of learning about myself. I think what really stands out to me is like, I don't know, we get along, we have really good conversation. That's part of the reason that you invited me on the podcast. I feel like I can really like be honest with you and be open about like my healthcare concerns. And I haven't really felt that with a lot of other healthcare providers. The type of work that you do is really unique to me. Like this is my first experience with myofascial release. I've not experienced it before. I've had, massages. I've done more like traditional sort of modern physical therapy sort of stuff with resistant bands and all that kind of stuff, which you do that stuff too, but you have this really unique fusion of things where you can dive in a different way than anybody else that I've worked with. So for me, it's I don't want to say it's been like life changing, but it has like really helped propel me down the path that I've wanted to go in life. You've let me keep climbing basically. So that's really cool to me. And I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, the honor is mine. I know that it can be a very vulnerable place to seek out healthcare for any injury or pain that you have. And I take that very seriously. Like I know that it takes a lot to reach out to somebody for help. And so once they do that, I do everything I can within my power to help facilitate the healing process. Now, something you had mentioned is, you've had physical therapy and healthcare experiences in the past, primarily through with your baseball injuries.
Mhm.
And I know that we had talked about, there's a transition when you give up kind of a big part of your life,
Mhm.
something that you might identify with. Can you talk us through what your transition was with that?
My transition from sort of exiting baseball, is that
Yeah,
the
like being
question?
a known as a baseball player to no longer a
Yeah,
baseball player.
man, that was a hard transition. So I played for about, I guess, 11 years from about the time that I was five, like playing t-ball. And then I played like pretty high level. It was called like the select league. It's like club soccer, right? You had to try out, you had to do the whole thing, travel a lot for tournaments and that sort of stuff. And then I started playing, and that's kind of where the injury started. But when I went to high school, the expectation was like time to join the varsity team, time to start kind of doing that thing. And the school that I went to for high school was a smaller school, but we actually had a really good baseball team. Like we were typically in the running for state championship and that sort of thing. So I don't want to say like expectations were high, but my expectations were high at least. And then I played freshman year and then I started playing sophomore year and it just kept happening where I just kept getting injured. So I decided like, all right, this isn't really working for me. I don't want to do this anymore. And I made the mistake of replacing it with nothing. I think that was the problem. And so it actually turned into be a little bit of a disaster where I definitely got a lot lazier in my life. Like I stopped caring so much about school. I didn't really have so much drive to like there was no big overarching goal for me. Baseball had kind of filled that role where it was like, cool, I'm gonna go like be the I was a pitcher really as my was my best position on the field. So I was going to pitch for the varsity team that was going to get me like a college scholarship and then from there you see how far you can go kind of a thing. And without that, all of a sudden I was kind of left without a big goal to strive for. So it was not an easy transition, and I think I struggled with it. I don't think I did a very good job of communicating how I was feeling to my parents. And I don't think that I really handled it in a very mature way. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think as a teenager, I don't know that anyone's handling anything in a mature
I mean,
way.
that's fair. That's totally
Um,
fair. Yeah.
but I guess, how did you make that transition? You said you didn't have like an overarching goal. Did you find one that allowed you to kind of like
Not,
transmute that
yeah.
energy? Yeah.
Yeah, not for a while. I spent a few years just kind of goofing off and partying. I got into drugs. I got into having a good time and all that kind of, stuff that young people tend to find themselves doing or can find themselves doing. And that was kind of the case through the rest of high school and then kind of the first half of college. And I actually wound up on academic suspension at college, which means that I couldn't go to that school for that semester because my grades were so bad. And so I ended up going to a different, like, small college just down the road from where I was living at the time, just to kind of like keep the ball rolling or the idea of the ball rolling. And I ended up taking an intro to philosophy class. I needed like the humanities credit, and I was like, well, whatever, I'll just take this class. And it actually ended up being a really amazing class. The first question that the professor asked us was, what is the good life? How do you answer that question? And there's not like a right or a wrong answer to that question, but it's a question that I ask myself like every so often, still to this day. And the interesting thing is that there's things that change, but there's also things that don't. So I'd say that that moment was actually the turning point as far as like, okay, how do we actually dig ourselves out of this hole that we've found ourselves in? But it didn't really start to come to fruition until maybe another 2 years down the road towards the end of college when I met my wife. Well, she's now my wife. So she had a son pretty young. He was about one when I met her, and I just kind of couldn't help it. I kind of just fell in love with her and him by extension. And that ended up becoming the big overarching goal. Was like, how do we raise this little dude in a way that's like mature, like in a way that, gives him the best chance in life. And that was kind of the replacement. It just happened a few years later. Yeah.
That is amazing. Thank you for
Yeah,
sharing
dude.
that.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a lot to unpack. The thing that comes to mind first is, it can be tough to go through different transition periods in your life. And for you, that was baseball. And for me, I grew up being a competitive soccer player, was on a select team, which is the club team, and had dreams similar to play college ball. But I blew out my ACL and, went through the rigors, ended up re-tearing and, trying to have this dream of playing in college. And I had gotten offers to play in D2 schools, D3 schools, but no scholarship offers. And so I opted to go to UT, which was a fantastic experience, the University of Texas at Austin, Hook'em. And, ended up finding some friends, growing out of my shell and, becoming more of who I was and more comfortable in my skin. But I had always had this dream of playing college ball. So actually, when I went to PT school, I applied to different programs and I got accepted into San Diego State. And one of the draws was they had a D1 NCAA soccer team. Now, I was planning on walking on, but here's the thing, when you are not playing at a high level for a year or a couple of years, your ability to feel the game is very slow. And so I remember trying out just for the club team at San Diego State. And, tryouts are multiple games, multiple days. And I remember my legs feeling so heavy, and I remember there was the captain of the club team who I overheard speaking with the coach of the actual D1 team and him saying, "Hey, sorry, we don't have a roster spot for you." And I was like, dude, if the captain of the club team can't walk on, I'm ready to let this dream go. I was like, bro, this
Yeah, man.
this ain't happening.
It's a similar story, although you were definitely more stubborn than me. Part of the reason
Yeah.
that I picked the college that I picked is because they didn't have a baseball team. It was like, I'm putting the nail in this coffin, dude. We're burying it 6 feet down. We're never digging this thing up. But that, different paths, I guess, to the same result. So
Yeah, similar strategy, I guess. But what I end up, here's the thing. I think that something that you noted is very insightful, and that is when you're making a transition from one thing to the next thing, you need to have something to take over that energy. You can't just say,
yeah,
"Hey, I'm just not going to do this," and then not feel that. And that comes into play, especially like breaking bad habits. I think it's like everyone can understand, let's say, it's not a good idea to smoke, right? But I don't think any smoker is just like, yeah, I want to accumulate this lung disease that we
yeah,
read
for
about,
sure.
right?
Yeah, I smoked for 16 years actually. Yeah.
Okay, yo,
And
okay.
I started after baseball.
Oh,
It needs something to do with my hands, man.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, oftentimes when people are talking about breaking bad habits, it's not just the understanding of, hey, this is a bad habit, but you need to fill it with something that I would say is more important. And I think for you, you came into fatherhood and this ultimate marriage that you facilitated this energy. You mean like, okay, it's enough about baseball. I'm ready to let that go, but how can I build the best life for my wife and my son?
Mhm.
And I think that anyone going through a transition like that, you want to have that in mind. When athletes retire from their sports, they have all of this energy that they used to divulge right into this craft, but now they don't have that. And I know retirement can be tough for a lot of athletes just because that identity that you attach to it, like you were a baseball player, I was a soccer player. What does that mean? It means so much. You do all these things. And when
Yeah.
you let that go, it is tough because now you're like, who am I? It's like you have that internal journey. Something that John mentions, who's the creator of myofascial release, he says the inner journey isn't the most important journey, it's the only journey.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
yeah, and I think when I hear you speak, you've had a lot of introspection, which is why I enjoy our conversations. What I ended up filling that soccer space with was actually dancing. So I actually went into like choreography dancing, which is something that I had,
That's cool. I didn't know that.
yeah, that
Yeah.
I had wanted to do at UT, but didn't have enough courage to do it. And I had all these fears of judgment. But when I went to San Diego State, I found some people dancing in a parking garage, and I was like, what's going on here? And then there's like, oh, we're a team. Shout out Intrinsic Dance Team in San Diego. But that's kind of how I facilitated that transition. And what's funny is more recently, I was playing soccer with my fiance Yvette. We were on the same team, but it was this like co-ed Division 3 recreational team. And what I learned about myself is I only know how to play soccer the way that I was grown or the way that I was taught, meaning like playing at a club level, let's say. And I can't play any other style. And so when I was playing in this rec D3 team, I found myself just being way too competitive than I needed to be. And it just needing to be like, hey, we're just out here to kick a ball around and maybe get some exercise. And I found myself, sometimes in sports when you're not able to contribute to the team in the way that you would like, you try to make up for that. So then
Try to
you like
force it. Yeah.
overextend yourself, and I overextended myself, and we were winning this game like maybe like 5-2. And it was like the last maybe 10 minutes. Like we were gonna win this game, but I wasn't as, I guess, impactful, and I just didn't get the touches that I would like. And so I tried to challenge this ball. And again, this is a D3 team, so it's like the technical piece is not at a high level. I ended up kicking the ball away from this girl, and I don't think she did it on purpose, but she kicked where she thought the ball would be, and that was my leg. And I blew out my ACL again.
Yeah.
And it's been a very challenging road. I think you are very grateful for things that you have been taking for granted. So for me, like just simply walking or going up and down stairs, there's such a gratitude with knowing and feeling this because it's been taken away from me. And I just recently went to doctor's appointment with the knee surgeon. And again, it's like I being in healthcare, I'm like, I hate this hospital setting. Like you sign up for an appointment. My appointment was at 10:10. The doctor didn't see me till like 11.
Hmm.
And then like it's just like I already kind of am like agitated, and then he's talking me through things, and I'm opting not to get surgery. But he asked me, he was like, yeah, like it sounds like you got this from a soccer injury, and are you planning on playing soccer again? And without a hesitation, I was like, nope, I'm ready to hang up the cleats. I'm ready to move on from this chapter. I'm done. And he was like, well, what are you trying to get back to if there's anything athletic? And I was like, rock climbing and pickleball, like very easy on the joints, at least the knee joints. And I'm ready to kind of like just put the nail in the coffin for this soccer idea. Austin FC fan, we have an MLS team. I'm a fan, but I'm like done with my playing days. And I have like no regrets about that. So, all that to say is, I think through these transition periods, and I think we go through them multiple times, you find that next thing that means more to you than the previous thing. And I think, like, let's say kicking a bad habit, it's like, it's not just the understanding of like this is bad, but it's like what's more important than this bad habit that I'm willing to give it up for versus just saying, hey, smoking's bad for you, you should just quit. Like everybody knows that. Smokers know that, but they don't quit, and it's because they don't see it as the same thing, or it's not as or it's more valuable than maybe other things.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes like a question of identity, I think. I think that's like such a key thing to understand about like who you define yourself as in your brain. That's who you become. That's who you are. Like if you want to change who you are, then you have to change how you think about yourself. Yeah. That's
Absolutely.
how I quit smoking. Yeah.
Yeah, how did you quit smoking? Can you share with the audience, let's say, who has maybe a smoking addiction, that how would they
Yeah.
work through that? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I like I'll just preface this real quick. Like I said, I smoked for about 16 years. I started almost immediately after I quit baseball, and I was like pretty bad, dude. Like lighting the one off the one before it kind of a thing. And I actually quit once successfully for like a couple of years. And then I started smoking again on my honeymoon because we were in Europe and like, hey, you smoke in Europe, right? That's what you do. And then a few years later, I was like, this is terrible. I really have to quit for real this time. And so actually what I did is I read a book. I think it's I think it's by a guy named Alan Carr, Carr. And the book is called Quit Smoking the Easy Way. And so I read the book, and then when you get to the end of the book, it's supposed to be like you smoke your last cigarette as you're sort of finishing the book, and then that's it. And that turned out to be true, dude. It turned out to be like a really easy way to quit smoking. And really, what the book does is it teaches you how to redefine what smoking is to you. Like you basically change your identity to where you're no longer thinking of yourself as a smoker or even as like an ex-smoker. You're just not someone that does that anymore. It's a really powerful technique, and he actually has books that do similar, that uses the same technique to do other things. I think there's one on weight loss and then maybe one other one on a different thing. But yeah, it just turned out to be like once you change, like redefine your relationship to the bad habit, and then it turned out to be I didn't want to do the bad habit anymore. So it was that book, and then I actually quit smoking about a month after I started climbing. The first time that I went climbing, I left the gym and was smoking a cigarette, and I was like, I said it to myself out loud in the car. I'm gonna have to quit doing this if I want to keep doing that. And it turned out that I did want to keep doing that. So it just gave me the motivation that I needed to keep going.
I love that. And it's exactly that. You valued rock climbing more than you valued smoking a
Yeah,
cigarette. And so
for
you
sure.
had to make that decision. And I love that story. And just because I'm also a rock climber and you have to facilitate what you can for your own health to keep doing the sport. And if that means kicking these bad habits, then it means kicking these bad habits. Now, I think you go through different transitions, whether that's baseball player to, college partier to now husband and father. How was that transition to being a husband and father?
I mean, I can't tell you it was like the easiest transition in the world, but it was one that I cared a lot about, and like the parts that were hard were okay. It was
What
like,
were what were those parts that were hard?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, you pick up a lot of bad habits when you're doing the things that I was doing, and then all of a sudden, you don't want to pass those on to the next generation, right? You want to try to set a good example and all of that stuff. So just moving away from some of those habits was hard, which makes sense, right? It's not always going to be easy just to stop doing the thing that's bad for you. And then I don't know, dude, like I was pretty young. I was like early 20s. So just trying to figure out like even how to be a good example. What does that even mean? Like I still haven't really figured that out for myself. So it just involved a lot of like really learning how to become a more open person. I'm typically like I'm pretty introverted. I have a pretty hard time opening up, although I think you maybe have a different perspective on that. Because I'm able to with you for whatever reason it is, but it's not the case for most people. So learning how to do that sort of on demand with my stepson is a hard challenge. It's actually one that I still work on today. As he's gotten older, that relationship has changed. Overall, I think in a good way, but it's still like where I have to sort of relearn how to navigate, what does it mean to have a teenager? And now he's 19. So like what does it mean to have a college student? Like it changes a little bit over time. But I think unlike the transition of like losing my identity as a baseball player, this is like it's sort of the opposite of that, where I'm choosing to take on a new identity. It wasn't sort of forced away from me. It's something that I'm opting into, and I think that made this one a lot more. I got a lot more satisfaction out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that being a husband and a father has a very rewarding feeling from that. I hope that I am blessed enough to have the same privileges. Now, something that I hear in certain relationships that I don't necessarily agree with is, let's say you're in a relationship and there's conflicts and you have a kid to possibly solve the conflict. Now, I bring this up because you're like, the person that I was going into this marriage was not the best version of me. But now I have the responsibility of raising a kid and what that means to be a good role model, father figure, to mold him to be the best person that he can be. Would you recommend that, or would you say, having a kid definitely forces you to grow up and think about things differently, but it's not how you should solve your problems?
I don't know if I would recommend it. I also don't know if I would qualify it as like I was using that as a way to solve my problems. At least not like in a conscious way. It wasn't something where I sat down with myself and thought it through like, I'm having a lot of problems right now. I better find a kid to solve
Yeah.
all these problems. Like it definitely was
Yeah.
not having that conversation with myself. So I don't know if I would recommend it. And ultimately, like, man, I hate to say it, but a lot of people, you know, maybe they start out with that idea like, oh, this will fix everything. And then when it doesn't immediately fix everything, they just bail. There's a lot of kids out there that don't have good relationships with their parents. So definitely don't do that. Don't recommend just using a kid as a solution. But it was more of like, this is what I have to do if I want to sort of keep them in my life. Yeah. And I did. I wanted to keep them in my life. Like I don't know if that's selfish or not, but
No, I think it
yeah.
means enough to you and you value
Yeah.
it enough to where you're like, dude, I need to be a better person for them, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's very admirable.
Yeah.
And
And I will say, like, over time, that's how it started. And then eventually now, like, I think it's become more like I need to be a better person for me. Like, if we want to keep this idea of like talking through transitions, there is one that happens further down the road where it becomes more, I want to do this for me. So,
and what is that transition?
man, it's kind of a weird nebulous one that I can't really point to a specific moment in time like I can with the other big changing turning points in my life. The transition is more just like an understanding that, I don't know, you don't get to live forever. Like you don't get everything forever. So you need to make the best of the time that you have. And I can point to a whole a long list of little things or just like these little experiences that happened. The first time we went backpacking as a family, we did it in Yosemite. We went to the top of Half Dome. That experience was just really incredible for me. It was just this idea, like, it was just this huge wake up call to see, like, hey, there's this whole big natural world out here, and you're just kind of ignoring everything in favor of like another six pack and another pack of cigarettes. Like maybe we make some changes and see what else is going on in this world. That was one thing, and then like finding software engineering was another thing. I actually really enjoy writing code. It lets me get into like a flow state. It lets me like solve problems in creative ways. It lets me build something. Like it ticks a lot of boxes for me that it turns out are like really positive boxes to be ticking. So I don't know. Like we could go on and on about that.
No, I love that. I think something that tends to happen, at least for me, is, you feel like you have to obviously put in a lot of work for your career. And work is just one facet of life. And when I get to go to a myofascial release seminar, like for example, I'll be going to Sedona in February for a healing seminar. That is my version of your half dome, where you just get to unplug from the day-to-day habits that you've built. You get to see nature in all of its majesticness, and that changes you if you give it the opportunity. Because I think when I go to myofascial release seminars, and for you, if you're open to it, there's a healing seminar that's designed for therapists and non-therapists. Like my fiance Yvette has taken it before, and she's an
That's
engineer.
cool.
And you really just get to feel what it feels like to be in this flow state that you are speaking of. And for me, if I could give that some more elaboration, is in myofascial release, it's about being present, centered, and intentional. And there's so much that comes through you that is the flow state, but it's not you chasing this flow state. It just kind of happens. And let's say in rock climbing, I think we get there because there's this element of fear of falling.
There's a
And
risk to
so
it. Yeah.
you got it.
Yeah.
So you have to be present, centered, and intentional to focus on the climb. But you also learn about who you are because you can sense yourself having these negative thoughts like, oh man, is this safe or is this good or not? And in myofascial release, what John will teach is part of the warrior's mentality where it's like, can you get in the observer or witness position? You're not your thoughts, but can you get to a place where you're observing your thoughts? And that is a place that we can operate from that allows us to do things more naturally versus what tends to happen when I'm doing the day-to-day stuff is like I kind of force it because I think it should happen this one way. And it's once I am able to let go of that and say, okay, there's a variety of different ways to get to the same place. You know, all roads lead to Rome. But if I'm so stuck and hell bent on this one path that I close out all the other roads and pathways, then I oftentimes find myself on roadblocks because of my own self, you know? So
For
I
sure.
think I think it's like, but you don't know what you don't know. You know, something that John will teach us is without awareness, there's no choice. And so if you're just in that day-to-day grind and you're just like rinse and repeat every day, and you don't have that experience of hiking on Half Dome or going to Sedona or something like that, that gets you to kind of like pause. I think that's the word. It's like if you could just be still for a moment, especially like out in nature, there is so much happening that you will just walk by. You know, I think sometimes it takes something like that. You know, I think oftentimes we get so busy with life that we forget what it feels like to actually be living, you know, and it takes a hiking trip, or it takes for me someone like John to kind of slow us down and say, these are the way that roses are supposed to look. Or, man, look at this nature. This is how it's supposed to be without the pressure of you needing to get somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
And then once you are able to feel that, then you come back and you want to apply that to your day to day. And this is still an ongoing process with me. You know, I haven't found that, like, how can I embody this feeling of being out in nature, Sedona, in my day to day? And so what I have to do is like I take these trips to unplug, to recenter
Mhm.
myself, and then come back with a fresh, clean slate, as opposed to just like continuing on this day-to-day grind and then just feeling like life is a little bit dull. Do you have any thoughts to share on that?
Yeah. First off, I think it's really insightful that you said like, it's all about a flow state. It's all about being present. It's all about being in the moment, being mindful. I think you do a really good job of personifying those characteristics like in our sessions. And I actually, as you were explaining all of that, it just occurred to me. I think because you are so good at it, I notice it and it actually like it's a sort of a call to action for me to rise up and meet you at that level. And so I think that's actually one of the reasons that our sessions are so beneficial for me is I can actually just rise up to kind of meet you at this like being present, just being aware and being mindful. And I think that's why I get so much out of our sessions. That's really interesting. But yeah, kind of more to your question, it turns out like simple is usually better. And I think that the modern life is kind of the opposite of that in so many ways. There's like it's just all distraction. We're sitting here on this Zoom call, and I made it a point before I got on this call, like every other application on this computer is closed right now. Like this is the only thing that's on the screen. It's full screen. Like, and if it wasn't, I would just get distracted and start staring off like at my notes application or Discord or whatever else is on here. And I think it's one of those things where you have to find a way to continually bring it back to that center. I started a meditation practice over COVID. I had a lot of time on my hands sitting around my house. And so I started doing just a simple mindfulness meditation in the morning where you just focus on your breath and you kind of get to that, what did you call it? The warrior mentality where you're just observing your thoughts.
Yeah, the Warriors way.
The warrior's way. I've not heard it called that before, but yeah, just you can't stop your thoughts. That's what your brain is supposed to do. I think a lot of people think that they're failing at meditation if they're thinking, but that's what your brain is supposed to be doing, is thinking thoughts. What you choose to do with those thoughts is like a totally separate thing. Turns out you're actually not your thoughts. That's kind of the key takeaway that I got from meditation anyway. But I do have to find time to go out in nature to really like reset. I think that's like ultimately that's where people evolved to be. Like we came out of the natural world, right? This is something that we've been doing for thousands of years is living on this planet. So it turns out we're actually like in tune with it if you just let yourself do it, if you let yourself go back out to it. So for me, I find time to go out and run every week. I live in a neighborhood with a really nice trail that runs around the perimeter, and we've got ponds and open meadows and trees and wildlife, and it's all happening in the the right time of year, there's bats that come out at sunset. I like running with the bats overhead. That's pretty awesome.
That is awesome.
And so I find time, I also have a dog, so I take the dog out on walks several times a day. You just have to find time to be outside. And when I take that time to go outside, I try to do things like leave my phone at home. I want to like if I'm walking with somebody like my wife, we want to be having a conversation together, not staring off at our phones and kind of ignoring the fact that we're in this beautiful world. I think you just have to find what works for you. For you, it sounds like maybe it's like you take the time to go on these retreats, quote unquote. You go out to Sedona or these other places that are incredibly beautiful. And I do the same thing. It's just kind of harder to get out and do those things. So I have to find ways to bring it closer to home, so to speak.
I think that's the journey that I'm on, and it's something that requires patience. I think we are kind of groomed in society to want things instantly, this instant
Hmm.
gratification. Whereas I think what the true reward is putting effort into something that takes time, and then because it takes time, you value it more. I
Yeah, I
think
agree with that 100%.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's a quote that I had heard that was like, if you get success fast, that will build your ego. But if you get success slow, that'll build your character. And in the realm of business, I think, yeah, there's a lot of those overnight successes, which I don't actually think they're overnight successes. Like it takes years to get to that point. Um,
Yeah.
the example that comes to mind is the iPhone game or the game on your phone called Pokemon Go. There's like this huge
Yeah,
craze
yeah.
that got people to walk outside and try to catch these Pokemon. And they had interviewed the founder and said, "Oh man, how does it feel to have this overnight success?" And he was like, "This was an overnight success 10 years in the making. Like so many things had happened." And
Yeah.
it can be often tough to see that, especially as you're starting something. And and yeah, so like I think that is just a part of life is to just be patient with it. It can take time and allow that to happen. And once you fixate on the road of like it's supposed to happen faster than it naturally does, that's where we get that obstacle or those conflicts.
Mm.
And I'm working through that. Something that I heard from you, which I think is important to restate, is you were saying that because I'm present, centered, and intentional in our sessions, you can feel that, and then it kind of gets you to elevate to that
I
level.
I elevate for sure, dude. Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of the reasons in terms of just like healthcare experiences, yours is so unique in my life at least. Like I just don't get that from a lot of other experiences that I've had at the clinic or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note because that's not something that I was taught or saying, it's not like I'm taking notes and saying like, oh, I was present and intentional and patient was elevated to this level. It's
Check the
like,
boxes at the end of the session.
yeah.
Yeah.
But this is something that is taught in myofascial release that the power of the therapist beyond the techniques is your ability to be present, centered, and intentional. Because then when you're in this flow state, the answers reveal themselves. You're able to challenge these belief systems that you may have read, but I think a lot of what happens in healthcare and I'm sure other industries is it gets intellectualized. It's like, oh, we understand the science so much and this,
Mhm.
and this is the outcome based on the research. Whereas with myofascial release, we're working on the fascial system, which isn't widely studied to the depth of other things. And so it's still relatively new, but there's still wisdom there. And there's different things that I think for you, you're able to just feel it. Something that John says is healing is feeling. And so the more you can feel it, the more you can heal it. And without me having to do all the medical jargon unless you ask for it, I just ask you to feel what you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I allow you to express that to me. And then that is where the healing happens. Something that I hope that I can share without it being too intimate is I've been able to work on your pelvis. And you have said, I guess, what has your experience been with that part of it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I guess just so everyone knows, like I've got my hips are out of alignment, so that's why we're working on my pelvis, and we've actually made huge progress, which is awesome. It's actually funny that you asked about that specific area. That actually is not that, I don't know, it doesn't bother me in a way that that might bother a lot of other people. The one time that it was like pretty weird was actually the intraoral session. You remember that? Yeah.
Yeah,
When I
in the
was like,
mouth.
hey,
Yeah.
this like crazy tension thing is happening, and then you were like, hey, do you mind if I, what were those muscles called on the inside of your mouth?
Your pterygoids.
Pterygoids. You're like, yeah, I'm gonna work on your pterygoids. And that actually unlocked, it was like so much better after you did that. It was incredible. But that was actually way more, I guess, intimate is the word
So
than working on my pelvis. Yeah.
So the reason I bring up the pelvis example is because in physical therapy, there's a huge, huge following for the pelvis doesn't move, right? Like it's just one
Oh,
block.
well, that's
Okay.
a lie.
Exactly. Okay. See how you can, so you're so easily to point that out and say, oh, that's a lie, right?
That's
But
wrong, dude. I can feel
well,
it move.
you got it, right?
Yeah.
Versus like when you're in these physical therapy spaces or medical spaces, they're like, there it doesn't move. Based on this research on this dead pelvis and it's dried out, it doesn't move. And like it just takes some common sense. Once there's a ton of ligaments
Mhm.
like surrounding the pelvis, and the ligaments are there to sense movement. Okay, so that's one. Two is like when you feel it, you cannot deny it, you know? And so there's one thing to being saying, hey, I'm holding up this piece of paper which shows research that the pelvis doesn't move. And then there's the other side of it. It's like, well, let me just put my hands here and let me see what you feel. And you're like,
Yeah.
wow, that moves way more than I thought it would.
Yeah. The first couple of times that we were working on it, you had the
Wedges.
wedge-shaped cushions that you had under my hips in different positions. And even without putting your hands and applying pressure onto my hips at that point, I could feel things like moving, even just from the realignment of the cushions. So
So
yeah,
all
that's crazy that people would try to say it doesn't move.
Thank you. Thank you. That's where I was trying to get to because there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And those who have never walked the path and are just holding their whatever, their knowledge as being like, this is the most important thing,
Mhm.
you're going to miss the bigger picture. Okay. So, that all is that to say is like different things that you might be aware of just because someone's wearing a white coat and telling you, hey, this is the way it works isn't necessarily true. And it's important to find that person who, one, is honestly just present, centered, and intentional, number one. But two, is able to meet you where you're at. So, it's interesting that you're saying, hey, I've had to elevate my level to meet you where you're at. For me, it's like, I have to meet you where you're at. And I don't like raising the level. I think we meet each other somewhere in the middle.
Okay, yeah.
But once we do that, we resonate. And myofascial release used to be called myofascial resonance because John was saying once you're able to resonate with the other person, there's this combined energy that gets amplified.
No, I can buy into that. I'm not
So
gonna argue with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and so whenever someone, and I'm speaking to my MFR therapist here, where it's like, oh, this doctor said this, and it's like, as long as your heart is in it to help the patient, then that is what matters the most. Now, if the doctor can't see that, or they feel like, hey, my years of medical experience matters more than your facilitating the healing process, that there's going to be a mismatch, and it's okay. I think whenever I approach doctors, I go in and apologize first, just saying like, "Hey, I'm really sorry about how things are going right now because, I'm sure that you've had tons of medical experience, you went through residency to learn what you do, but from what I'm trying to do here, it's just a little bit different. And when you apologize first, that cuts out a lot of the tension that can happen because obviously it's normally like an ego match. But if I could just go in with a servant's heart and just be like, hey, I'm really sorry that we're having this. I think you are great at what you do, but this is what I'm trying to do. And then finding that middle ground, trying to resonate by doing that is the approach that I would go with versus just being like, oh, you're wrong. The medical facility is terrible. And, based on
Hmm.
your research, that's hodgepodge. Like, that's not going to help anybody. And so, but it's cool to hear that you say that. Now, something that you had mentioned was the pterygoids. And for physical therapist or myofascial release therapist, John teaches that there's tension that gets held in three P muscles. That's your psoas, your piriformis, and your pterygoids. And typically that's because when we are stuck in our sympathetic nervous system or our fight or flight response, we just feel all of this intense stress. And that is by design. You know, when we are getting chased by a bear, you want that to send the alarms off
Yeah,
so you can hightail it out of there, right? But what ends up happening in our modern day lives is instead of a bear chasing us, we'll take jobs where our managers are terrible to us or the
yeah,
working environment is just highly stressful. But then that's normalized. So then we just kind of live with this extra stress and tension
yeah,
forever, you know? And so what I would recommend, especially with self treatment, is if you just focus on these three P muscles, which is your psoas, because oftentimes you'll want to kick, or your piriformis, because you want to run, or your pterygoids, which is in your mouth, where you want to bite, that will help unlock a lot of stuff. And so with you, you know, I think we have built this relationship where I can say, hey, you know, I think this is involved. Are you open to it? And you are trusting me enough to say, okay, I trust this guy enough to see what he's
yeah.
seeing. And for me, it's like, hey, I'm present and centered and intentional. So these things are coming up. I don't know to go there before the session, but something will lead me there and I'll just be curious and I'll follow it. And then the confirmation is when, you know, I put a glove on, my fingers in your mouth, and you're like, whoa, there's so much happening that I didn't even recognize.
That was a crazy amount of tension on that muscle. Yeah.
And it's like that for a lot of people. So for those of you who have yet to take fascial cranium, I know they teach it. In myofascial release 2, they teach it. Definitely learn those things because it is such a valuable piece of the healing process as echoed by Travis.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, I wanted to ask you, you know, you've asked this question to yourself at many periods and chapters of your life. What is the good life?
You want like my current answer to the question?
I want your let's go past, present, and future answers to that question.
Gotcha. I don't know if I can like recite them to you by rote. It's a question that's really hard to answer. I think that any answer that you tell someone, that person, they can't tell you that you're wrong, at least not with any justification behind it. The only person that can tell you whether you're right or wrong in your answer to that question is yourself. So the sort of the textbook answer that sort of sidesteps the question is the one that Socrates gives is it's a contemplative life. Like ultimately the good life is a contemplative life. And in college, like when I first heard that question, I really liked that answer. I actually went on to major in philosophy and I went from academic suspension like to the point where I was on the dean's list when I graduated. So it was a huge turnaround. So
That's
it was a
awesome.
good answer to the question. And so then the question became like, well, what am I going to do after college? I just kind of figured out how college works. And you can't really like you can't really do much with a philosophy degree, right? There's not a lot of people banging down your door to get you to come work for them with a philosophy degree. So what a lot of people end up doing, they'll take it as like a stepping stone to a law degree or they wind up just kind of going the academia route and they go to grad school and then eventually maybe become, you know, a doctor of philosophy and they wind up teaching philosophy to other confused kids like myself. But I didn't want to go that route. I wanted to avoid, I guess, what I thought of as the ivory tower. I wanted to kind of be out in the world experiencing it. I wanted to leave my comfort zone, I guess, and like grow a little bit. And so that kind of became the next answer to the question because I was in this relationship with this awesome girl, but she had a son. Like you know, obviously, you know, he's hanging out with her. You can't get one without the other. So if you're gonna keep going, keep growing, you're gonna have to kind of grow into a father figure. So that kind of became the answer to the question for a long time. It's like the good life is a life where you can grow as a person. And that's a really open-ended answer, but it kind of has to be, I think, in a lot of ways. And in some ways, that's still the answer to the question. It's just gotten a little more specific. Like I want to be able to grow emotionally, and I want to be able to grow spiritually. Those are areas that I think, you know, as a very like rationally minded child, I wasn't religious in any way. I didn't like that whole area. As I've gotten older, I've kind of come around to maybe exploring more of that. And for a long time, I sort of make this joke with my wife like about emotions, like you just bury it way down deep where you never feel it and never touch it. And it was like sort of a half joke where like I was actually doing that, but I was just saying it in a joking way. And then it turned out that's actually not a good thing to be doing. So I need to like kind of grow with the ability to express my emotions because by expressing them, you can actually like expel them, right? You can
Mhm.
actually sort of move past them. And it's okay, like it's okay to feel things that maybe you can't explain in a rational way. That was kind of a something that I've had to learn along the way. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. There's sort of more specific nuances to it. One thing for me is like a good life for me is helping the ones that I love do the things that they love. I've thought about that a lot with my stepson, sort of, graduating college or graduating high school and starting college. I just want to, if I can build him a launch pad, I'd love to see how high he can fly. You know what I mean? Like, let's give him a solid foundation and just see what he wants to build with his life. So it's kind of where I'm at right now.
I love that answer. I think life happens with four different variables, and that's mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And it seems like you're embarking on that. And what I love about that answer is, I guess, the chapter of life in which you are in the present. You find that a good life is one that you can help support those that you love. I think so much, especially living in America, there's this me individuality philosophy or mindset. And for you to say, hey, the good life is actually helping someone else be the best that they can be in whatever it is that they choose to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I don't know, part of that entails like helping yourself to the point that you're able to help someone else, right? It's not like
Absolutely.
I'm just totally giving and it's all about somebody else. Like there's me in there too. But I don't know, like how do you measure success? If you're just measuring it with money, then it would be silly to help someone else. But it's not really how I chose to measure success. So I've got my basic needs covered, and then some. So I don't need more. I just need to help people more. That's where I'm going to see more success.
And I think that's so wise because it sounds like you're content, which is a great place to be. Some people would say, like, what is happiness? And I think I heard an interview somewhere where it was like, instead of it being happiness, you need to find where's peace and where's contentment.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think that one are two emotional things that you chase, these feelings and emotions of feeling peace and contentment. Versus if it's just about a dollar amount, you're just going to keep raising that dollar amount. And it's a never ending game. And something that John will mention is, he works with people who have the money to buy whatever toy that they could want, like a mansion or a boat or a yacht or whatever, but he feels this deep sadness within them because the material world cannot shape your emotional and spiritual world, which is the more important thing, I would say. But in life, you see it all around you. And so it's tough not to give into that because you see it all around you. Everyone around you is measuring themselves based on these material things. And it's not unlikely that you're also going to be in that ecosystem. Now, for you, I guess, how would you define happiness?
I think you know how I define it, but I don't think happiness is a state of being. I think that it's a really maybe naive way to think about that. Like I'm just gonna become happy and then I'll just be happy forever. I think happiness is an act, and I think like what I mean by that is you have to do something to become happy. I think as a human being, you're sort of hardwired in that way. And for me, the answer that like the way that I answered, like, well, what do you do to become happy? The answer is happiness is the act of solving problems. And you can point to examples in your own life, I think, if you sit and think about it for a second. I'm really happy at the end of a hard day when I sit down to some awesome food like with my family, right? Like that's a good moment for me. I think a lot of people would probably say that one of the happiest moments for them on any given day is that moment when they crawl into bed. Like right when you first get into bed, and you can feel so happy in that moment. And I think like, okay, like I don't know what you did during the course of your day, but whatever you did, you got through it to the point that you could get into bed at the end of the day, right? Like you solved your need for shelter. I don't know how you solved it, but you did it in some way. Like when you sit down to a meal with your family, maybe like maybe it's not like a one-to-one relationship there, but you solved enough problems to sit down to a meal with your family, right? That's a really happy moment for you. Even just having a family to sit down with can feel really happy for me sometimes at least. It's like, well, whatever else is going on in my life, like I figured out how to, be with the ones that I love. And for me, like that's a really happy moment whenever I have that realization. I think the human brain does a really good job at creating problems, right? It doesn't matter like how rich, poor, old, young, like whatever adjective you want to put in front of it, you are, your brain is going to come up with a problem, right? And it may not be a worthwhile problem, but it'll find something that it doesn't like, and it'll make you fixate on that thing. And I think, if you're trying to kind of grow as a person, what you really need to do is learn what are the problems that matter and what are the problems that don't matter, and kind of teach yourself how to make those decisions. But because you're always going to find problems, you're always going to solve them to feel better. Like that's just what your brain does. It's part of like the human condition. At least it's my opinion. I don't want to speak authoritatively, but
So I love your answer. One, it sounds like another word that comes to mind for me for you is gratitude. You're noticing what it means to be able to get into bed or to share a meal with your family. And those things can become so small that you don't recognize how grateful it is to have those opportunities.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, but you've also said that gives you some happiness as well, which I think is amazing. And what I love about your perspective is yes, it's by human nature to find the problems in things, and there will always be a problem. But what I love is you have this outer shell of that, this bigger piece of that is like, but then the next step is you have the ability to solve it because you see it
Yeah.
versus what I generally hear with a lot of people is they'll just complain about the problems, and
Now, see,
that's not
that's a
gonna help.
problem. That's a problem.
You
If you're
got it. That's
complaining
the
about the
problem.
problem,
That's the
yeah,
problem.
that's a problem worth solving right there. And that's like it kind of goes back to what I was saying about I love helping other people. Like for me, I've realized that a lot of the problems that I could solve, they're not really worth much in the grand scheme. They don't really give you that good dopamine hit. But like helping my wife figure out the next step of her career, or helping my stepson kind of take these early steps into adulthood, that feels good, dude. That makes me feel really happy. Yeah.
That's awesome. And yeah, I don't want to add anything to that because I think that's the perfect way to kind of go out. Now, before we head out of here, are there any last thoughts you'd like to share with my audience?
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer off the cuff. I think I'd just like to say thank you for listening, I guess.
Welcome.
First and foremost, thank you for having me on. This has been really interesting and a unique experience for me. I'd say it's my wife told me, have fun leaving your comfort zone because she knows I hate doing this kind of stuff.
Oh, did you? You rocked it. You knocked it right out of the
Thanks,
park.
dude. Thank you. Yeah, no, like I said, I'm pretty introverted, but it's like a conscious effort to kind of push past that because I think, I don't know, if you can connect with people, just make your world bigger and your life richer. Like, so that's why I'm trying to do that. So thank you for listening to try to do that for the past hour or so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the honor is mine. I just want to thank you for being so open and honest with us, sharing maybe chapters of your life you weren't super proud of to the chapters of your life you are super proud of. So I think you shared a lot of insights that not only I learned from, but I'm sure my listeners will have a learning experience as well. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. Cheers. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Myofascial Health. I help myofascial release therapists create beautiful websites for their MFR practices, even if they aren't tech savvy. If you're just starting your MFR practice, or you're an experienced MFR practice owner, learn more about how it can help at www.myofascial.health/website.